Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning is Rosh Hashanah daf Kaf. Today's daf is sponsored by Diana Bloom in loving memory of her Zaidi, Israel Marmurek Israel Ben Manis, on the occasion of his yurtzeit, which was on the 17th of Cheshvan, and a refuah shlema for Shimon Avraham Ben Chana. Okay, we hope you have some knowledge of astronomy because we're going to be getting to that today. And if you don't, no worries, we'll try to help you out, although I'm going to keep it on a very basic level. I'm going to already tell you that there's things I know, there's things I don't know, and I know what I don't know. So I'm going to explain this, particularly on the second side of today's daf. I'm going to explain it in a very simple manner. Know that there's many, many commentaries, many differences of opinion about how to understand this daf. And there's some seeming inaccuracies about the way they describe certain things, which is the comment, the Mefarshim comment on and try to explain, etc. Anyway, I'm going to just keep it as simple as possible. But anybody who wants more information, there's what to find out there. I'm sure I didn't look, but Talmudology usually has interesting things. They often come up after I teach. So I imagine he'll have something on it by Jeremy Brown. So you can look that up online, see if there is. You can research. There's lots more to do here. I'm going to keep it simple. Okay, we're going to start first from the bottom of Yud Tet Amud Bet. Okay, we did that. Okay. I just want to talk about time change. So if you come to the Zoom, we changed the clocks on Saturday night in Israel. So just pay attention to the time wherever you are, that you know that you're in sync with where we are in Israel. Okay. Shalchu leila Mar Ukva. Adar hasamuch l'Nisan la'olam chaser. We finished with this yesterday, that they sent to Mar Ukva that an Adar, which is the Adar that comes right before Nisan, sometimes there's two Adars. So the one that's right before Nisan is always a 29-day month. Again, I want to give some background. We talked about this yesterday. I'll talk about it again. Every month is about 29 and a half months on the lunar calendar. So there are 29 and a half days. So therefore, every other month, generally, we have Maleh Chaser, Maleh Chaser, Maleh Chaser, right? Basically, a 30-day month and a 29-day month and a 30-day month and a 29-day month. We already learned that Elul is almost always 29. Also, Adar is almost always 29, which, by the way, makes sense. They'd be in sync, because if we do Maleh Chaser, Maleh Chaser, Maleh Chaser, right, and they're divisible by 2, the difference between them, right, it would make sense that it would be the same. So now they say Adar Samuch Nisan is always Chaser. Mativ Rav Nachman says, wait, what you're saying doesn't really make sense, in line with a Mishnah we're going to see on tomorrow's daf, which is Al Shnei Chodashim Mechalalim et HaShabbat Al Nisan v'Al Tishrei. There's only 2 months a year that we allow witnesses to break Shabbat, Chalel Shabbat, to get to the rabbis in Jerusalem, to the Beit Din, to testify about the new moon. We'll talk about that. There's a debate exactly to what extent can they break Shabbat. Okay, that's not our issue right now. If they say, right, if you say sometimes it's 30 days, sometimes it's 29 days, that's why we let them l'chalel Shabbat, because we need to know, is it a 29-day month? Is it a 30-day month? Again, the witnesses, if they come the night of the 30th and they see the new moon, then the 30th becomes day number 1. And if they don't see the new moon on day number 30, then 31 becomes. So we understand that it could be either or. There's a reason, l'chalel Shabbat, so that they can come and tell us what's the story. But if you say it's always 29, we have absolutely no reason to allow them to be Mechalel Shabbat, because if we're allowing them to be Mechalel Shabbat, it's right. We know exactly when Rosh Chodesh is. Certainly don't need people to desecrate Shabbat to tell us Rosh Chodesh is exactly when you thought Rosh Chodesh was going to be. To which the Gemara answers, Mishum de mitzvah l'kadesh ala re'iyah. No, in fact, there's a special commandment, and it's derived from the verses in Shemot where it talks about HaChodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodashim. That teaches you that there's a special mitzvah to make a bracha, to decide on the new moon based on witnesses' testimony. And therefore, we're going to allow them to break Shabbat. Now, here comes the problem. We allow them to break Shabbat for Nisan and Tishrei. Well, if that's the case, right, the Gemara should ask immediately, then if it's a mitzvah, the Kadesh al Pi Riyah, why do we only allow it for those 2 months? Doesn't make any sense. We'll get back to that much later. For some reason, the Gemara doesn't ask that question, but I want it to be clear. The whole point is they desecrate Shabbat for Nisan and Tishrei because it's a mitzvah to have witnesses testify, and then for the Beit Din to determine the new moon based on witnesses' testimony. If that's a mitzvah, it should be every month we should be allowed to desecrate Shabbat. So it's a little bit strange. We'll get back to that later. So until now, just to clarify, and you can see this on the chart, this is the first version of the sugya. We have two different versions. They sent to Mar Ukva that Adar that's near Nisan is always 29 days. Rav Nachman questioned that based on the Mishnah. It says only for Nisan and Tishrei we can desecrate Shabbat, the witnesses. Why would they need to desecrate Shabbat? The Gemara answers, because the mitzvah. Iked Amr, some people say, Rav Nachman af ananami tanina. Rav Nachman comes and says, I'm going to prove what you said from the Mishnah, as opposed to saying, I'm going to question what you said from the Mishnah. I'm actually going to prove it. How so? That's the Mishnah. If you say, you'll have to understand this a little better after we read the second part. But if you say it's always 29 days, that's why we desecrate Shabbat, because it's a mitzvah to do it, to make it sanctified based on witnesses' testimony. But Iyamar Bishlama, Iyamar Zimnim Malay, Zimnim Chaser. But if you say sometimes it's Malay, sometimes it's Chaser, now you're going to have to make a little bit of a jump. There's two issues. Number one is, can it be potentially 29 or 30 days, right? Which means Rosh Chodesh is going to be on day number 30 or day number 31 of Adar. Or, right, it's tricky. When I say it's going to be on day 30 or day 31, if Rosh Chodesh is on day 30, that ends up meaning day 30 becomes day number 1, and day 29 was the last day of the month. If it's day number 31, day number 31 becomes day number 1, and 30 becomes, right, the previous month becomes 30 days. Now, if you say, number 1, it could be either or, then the assumption is that if you say it could be either or, the assumption is that the rabbis can also play with that. And if they decide they want to, if you say it's always 29, then the rabbis can't start switching around and saying, we're going to determine, even if the rabbis have the power, apparently, although we'll see a bit of a debate about this, can the rabbis control when the holidays come out? Can they decide, we don't want the holiday to be on this day, right? We don't want Yom Kippur next to Shabbat. So let's add an extra day. Okay, you can only add an extra day to Elul, or let's say to Adar. Let's say you want Pesach to come out on a different day. If you can only do that if it could be either 29 or 30. So if it could be either 29 or 30, okay, then there'd be no reason l'chalel Shabbat. Why? Even if the new moon was seen on the night of the 30th, and then the 30th should really be Rosh Chodesh. If the rabbis can play with it and they can determine if they want that Adar is 30 days, then let's avoid Chilul Shabbat, which is always considered a very serious matter. And let's just have the rabbis decide on a year like that. We'll just push it off another day and determine that Rosh Chodesh will be on Sunday instead of on Shabbat. And that way we won't have to have witnesses desecrate Shabbat. So if, according to this reading, it's the opposite of what we said earlier. If you can play with the dates, then there's no reason to allow them to desecrate Shabbat. Last time we said the logic. We're going to see today a lot of logic and then prove it the exact opposite way. First, we tried to say, if it's always 29, then we have no need for witnesses to desecrate Shabbat. Now we're saying, no, if it's 29 days, we need them to desecrate Shabbat because it's a mitzvah. And they'll determine Rosh Chodesh is on Shabbat, and they'll have to because that's the day Rosh Chodesh is. And it's the only possible day because it's only 29 days. But once you say that Adar could be 30 days, then the rabbi shouldn't allow this Shabbat desecration by basically saying, we'll just push off Rosh Chodesh this time to the next day. So therefore, he brings this Mishnah as a question according to this version. So now the Gemara says, how are we going to answer that? If Shabbat falls on the 30th day, which is the way I just described, then you're right. Then there is no reason to desecrate Shabbat. They could just push it off to 31. However, who's to say that's the only case? And you could say that what we're referring to here is the 31st day comes out on Shabbat. Then we allow witnesses to come to desecrate Shabbat because they need to look at mitzvah l'kadesh al piriyah. And therefore, you could still have it that way, that it could be 29 or 30 days the previous month, meaning Rosh Chodesh could be on day number 30 or day number 31, but we'd still allow Shabbat desecration if Shabbat fell on the 31st day. And therefore, that's what's, this could go either way, and therefore this doesn't prove anything. So we basically, the first Rav Nachman brought the Mishnah as a question. We answered the question by saying mitzvah l'kadesh al piriyah. The second version brought Rav Nachman as a proof. Rav Nachman brought the Mishnah as a proof, and then we basically disregarded his proof and said it's not a necessary proof. But now both of these were under the working assumption that mitzvah l'kadesh al piriyah, right? Either the reaction of the Gemara to Rav Nachman in the first, or Rav Nachman himself in the second. There was this working assumption that it's a mitzvah l'kadesh al piriyah. So Mativ Rav Kahana says, this doesn't really make sense. It's a mitzvah l'kadesh al piriyah. And this goes back to what I said earlier, which is if it's a mitzvah, you should be able to desecrate Shabbat every month and not just Tishrei and Nisan. So Mativ Rav Kahana says, look at the Mishnah also on Daf Kaf Aleph, Amabed, Keshamikdash kayam mechalalim afal kulan. When the Mikdash was standing, we would allow Shabbat desecration for every single month. Why? Because every month we needed to determine when Rosh Chodesh is, for what purpose, what was different in the temple and now in terms of Rosh Chodesh. There was a sacrifice brought in the temple. So mipnei takanata korban, the Mishnah says, because of the sacrifices brought on Rosh Chodesh, you needed to know what day Rosh Chodesh was. So it was very important. We allowed Shabbat desecration for that. Just like to sacrifice the korbanot, you can desecrate Shabbat. So to determine when we do the sacrifices, that was important. But midekulu lav mishum the mitzvah l'kadesh al hariyah, right? But what happened when the temple was destroyed? They stopped that, and only in Nisan and Tishrei. So they say it's obvious that the reason they allowed desecration of Shabbat on all the months in the time of the temple was mishum takanata korban, and not because mitzvah l'kadesh al piriyah. Right? So since those are lav mishum de mitzvah l'kadesh al piriyah, the reason we allowed Shabbat desecration in the time of the temple for every month, for the witnesses to come to the temple and testify, was because of the korban, not because of the mitzvah l'kadesh al piriyah. And therefore, Nisan v'Tishrei nami lav mishum de mitzvah l'kadesh al piriyah. Right? The Nisan and Tishrei also shouldn't be for that reason. So then he says, if you say, sometimes it's malay. So again, back to understanding then, so why do we allow it to be desecrated? So now he says it must be that zimnin malay, zimnin chaser, and that's why, since it could be this way and that way, that must be why we allow Shabbat desecration for these witnesses. But iyamar lo'olam chaser, amay mechaladinam, within the absence of the answer, it's a mitzvah l'kadesh al piriyah. And we know that it's always going to be 29 days, and there's really absolutely no reason to allow the witnesses to come. And therefore, tiyuvta. This is really a question on what we've established until now, because it really doesn't make any sense. Ki'ata Ula. Now we're up to a new thing. Ula comes to Bavel and he tells them the following thing. Ibru ala Elul. We made Elul a 30-day month, right? Even though Miyamot Ezra, there hasn't been a month, it was 30 days in Elul. He comes and he says, we made Elul a 30-day month this year. And in addition, he says to them a very strange line, which we're going to have to figure out. Amar Ula, Yade Chavrim Bavlai, my Tivuta Abdina Bahdayu. Do you, Bavlim, know what good we did to you by doing this? Okay, do you realize we did this for you? Okay, we're going to have to figure out why they would have done it for the Babylonians, and it wasn't good for that it was specifically good for the Babylonians, not the people living in Israel. What's the deal? So the Gemara says, my tivuta. First of all, what was the benefit of them moving the days? Okay, by basically making it a 30-day month. They pushed off all the holidays by a day. What was so good about that? So this Ula Amang Mishum Yalkaya, he says, because of the vegetables. Imagine you go out to the field to pick your vegetables on Friday, Erev Shabbat, then it's Shabbat, then it's Chag or Yom Kippur or whatever it might be, or it's, let's say, Yom Kippur and then Shabbat. By the time you get to Shabbat, your vegetables are rotten and you need fresh vegetables. So, right, I don't know what vegetables they're worried about that spoil so quickly, but whatever it was, they were concerned about them spoiling, right? Imagine also without refrigeration. Right, nowadays, go to the vegetable store, right? They keep, a lot of the stuff is out, but they often keep the ones in the back, with refrigerated. Anyway, the point is they were worried about the vegetables rotting, and therefore they said, we're going to split between Shabbat and either a holiday or Yom Kippur. We don't really know yet what. He was worried about people dying. Okay. He was worried about somebody dies. They'll be left for 2 days in a row. The body will rot. That's going to be very unpleasant. Obviously, this should be an issue both for Israel and Babylonia, so it's a little bit strange again. We have to get back to that. So first they want to know, my benai, what's the difference between Ula, practical difference between Ula and Rabbi Acha bar Chanina? This is why I gave that example. First, it was the first one that popped into my head, but it was actually a bad example because if you say Shabbat, Yom Kippur, so there's going to be a difference, the halacha, between the two. Why? Okay, people die no matter what, right? It'll still be the same issue. Shabbat and Yom Kippur come out next to each other. And therefore, you would push off and add an extra day to Elul so that Yom Kippur doesn't end up on Sunday. When do you need vegetables on Yom Kippur? You don't eat vegetables on Yom Kippur. You don't eat anything. So when are you going to eat them? L'orta is at night. Right? Remember from the Orla Ba'asar, which means night means day. A day means night, right? It sounds like light, but it really means night. Anyway, L'orta tarachumaite. In the evening, right? Yom Kippur's over at night. Go out and pick some vegetables. And the eating is after Yom Kippur, not on Yom Kippur when it's forbidden to pick. So therefore, that would be a nafkamina. That would be a difference, the halacha between the two. However, the Gemara asks, and this happens sometimes when there's two reasons given. They say, Ulamanda amal mishum yarakai. We have the same structure by sukkah with the animal, building the animal on the wall. We're worried he might die, or we're worried, right? There were two options. And then they said, well, the one who said that, why isn't he worried about that? So same thing here. The one who says mishum yarakaya, liabre mishum metaya. So maybe you don't have to worry about the vegetables in Yom Kippur. It falls on Sunday, but you would have to worry about people dying. So why aren't you worried about that? Right? It's the same concern that the heat is going to cause problems because of either the vegetables or people dying. So, the case would be when Yom Tov comes out next to, okay, we're basically saying it can't be a nafkamina because we're assuming that the one who was concerned for vegetables is also concerned about people dying. That's the assumption that they conclude. So therefore, that wouldn't be a difference, the halacha. So what would be the case then? Yom Tov samuch l'Shabbat ben lefaneh ben lachaveh. We don't want a Yom Tov to come out next to Shabbat. Doesn't matter before or after. Why? Mandamar mishum yarakaya ma'abrina. So now, if you're worried about vegetables rotting, you need your vegetables for Yom Tov. So yeah, add an extra day. It would be good for them. But lamandamar mishum metaya. Efshar ba'amameh. Do you remember? We learned already that a Gentile can bury a Jewish person on Yom Tov. If you have 2 days and you don't want the body to rot, right nowadays we don't generally do this because we have ways to preserve the body, refrigeration. But in those days you couldn't. So a Gentile can do the burial for you. So therefore, it's not such a concern. So now again, they say the reverse of what we did in the last sugya. Okay, so you're not worried about dead people because there's a solution for that. But you should still be worried about the vegetables. He says you could heat up the vegetables and boil them in water, and that will keep them, they'll last longer that way. I don't know if you want to try this, if that's really true, but that's what they claim. So now they say, well, okay, but now we're back to a bigger basic question. If that's your concern, why is it a difference for the Babylonians? It should be also for the people in Eretz Israel. So the answer, alma. It's very hot and humid in Babylonia, and in Israel, it's a place where there's a lot of mountains, and because of that, there's a breeze. Maybe this was before global warming, because where I live, it's quite hot and humid, but it also depends maybe where you are in Israel. But they assume and I don't know, I've never compared what was then Babylonia and the weather there. I haven't been there, but the question is, right, they assume there's a difference in temperature, and therefore it's much hotter and more humid in Babylonia, and therefore the need for this is much greater there than it is in Israel. Okay. The truth is, even where I live, generally, unless you're in the middle of a heat wave, it's not so bad when it comes, we're in between seasons then. So it's actually not too bad. Okay, so now the Gemara says, wait a minute. Ula said that they were ma'abrinan la'elul, right? So now they say, and that they did it in order to make the holidays come out on a better day. This goes back to what I said earlier, that there's two issues. Number one, can certain months be malay or chaser? And number two, is it, right, just because they could be malay and chaser doesn't necessarily mean that you can play with the dates if you want. That just means, maybe the new moon will be seen then, maybe then. But they make another jump to say, oh no, if you need to, the rabbis have the power to basically change the dates as they see fit. So now we're going to actually question that assumption. And that was the assumption of Ula. Like we in Israel changed the date to make it better for you. So Hatani Rabba Bar Shmuel, didn't you bring a brayta that says, Yachol kashem shema'abrin et hashana litzorech, kach ma'abrin et hachodesh litzorech. You might have thought just like you can add an extra month, you can also add an extra day if you want, litzorech, for some sort of need, right? So that's Ibor Shana is adding a whole, making a leap year, so that you could do it if there's a need. So likewise here, you might have thought you could do it if there's a need. Talmud Lamal, hachodesh hazeh. This month is for you, Rashi Chodashim. That's what the verse says in Shmot. Kazeh ra'eh v'kadesh. Zeh often means like God pointed to something, and he said, look here, when the moon looks like this, that's when you determine the new moon, that it's Rosh Chodesh. So that sounds very specific. When it looks like this, it's Rosh Chodesh. If it doesn't look like that, or it looks like this today, you can't say tomorrow's Rosh Chodesh. It's today that's Rosh Chodesh. So it sounds like you can't really play around with it, and that's what this brayta clearly says. So Amarava lo kashya, kam la'abro, kam la'kadsho. He answers a very interesting answer. To say this is the new moon on day number 30, when you haven't seen the new moon, that you can't do. But if you see the new moon on day 30, and you want to make day 31 Rosh Chodesh, that's exactly what Ula did, then that you're allowed to do. Okay, you can play with it. Okay, when I told you today we're going to see logic and the opposite logic. Okay, later we're going to say someone else says the exact opposite. But right now we're going to assume that, and we'll prove the logic each time, that once it's Rosh Chodesh already, and it makes sense. If it's you haven't seen the new moon, then it's still part of the last month. You can't make that a new month. But if the new moon appeared and you want to just push it off a day and say, well, tomorrow's the first day, even though really tomorrow's the second day, that you're allowed to do because you're already in the new month. So that makes sense. So therefore, we're going to go back and reread the brayta, because what did the brayta say? The brayta said you might have thought just like you can add a day to add a month to the year for a need. You can also ma'abrin et hachodesh. You can also add another day. So now they're going to say, note the words there. It says la'abel, right? You can't. So they're going to change that, because then the brayta concluded, no, you can't be ma'aber. So now they're going to say, oh no, that's not what it read. Okay, it read differently, because specifically we're saying, oh no, you can do that, and the brayta said you can't do that. So hachi kamar, this is how you should read the brayta. Yachol kashem shema'abrin et hashana ve'et hachodesh litzorech. We're going to move the ibor into the first part. You might have thought just like you can add another month to a year. You can add another day to a year, to a month. If you see a need, you might have thought, kach mekadshin et hachodesh litzorech. You might have thought you could also declare the month starting a date earlier. Talmud lomar, hachodesh hazeh kazeh re'eh b'kadesh. You can't. Okay, so then it becomes a little more limited. So you can add an X, you can push off Rosh Chodesh from the beginning, but you can't make it start earlier. So like I said, there's good logic to it. Again, we're going to have to see what's the logic on the other end. And this actually matches what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, who says, Ma'aimim al ha'edim al chodesh shenir'eh b'zmano la'abro, ve'em ma'aimim al ha'edim al chodesh shelo nir'eh b'zmano la'kadsho. Now we get to something really interesting. Ma'aimim al ha'edim means we can threaten witnesses to either come testify or not come testify. This is going to be a very strange thing. You can, according to this reading of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, according to his understanding of this halacha, there was this understanding, there was some halacha of things you can force people to testify or not testify about certain things and not force them about other things. So according to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, you can threaten them if the month was seen bismano, meaning the night of the 30th, there was a new moon, la'abro. You can basically threaten them and say, don't come to court. We don't want you coming to court to testify. That makes sense, right? It makes sense to basically tell someone, don't testify. Okay, but you can't force witnesses to claim they saw the new moon when they didn't see the new moon, right? That would be insane. To basically tell people, listen, lie and testify in court that you saw the new moon. You can't do that. Okay, so that actually matches perfectly with what we just explained. That's exactly the logic. You can't make it earlier, but you can push it off a day. And by doing that, right, well, how would you do it? You would basically threaten the witnesses and tell them, don't come testify. But wait a minute. Ini, is that really true? He says, Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya says to Rabbi Yomi, you should know that all of his life, Rabbi Yochanan taught us this, meaning I didn't just hear this on a one-off, but all throughout his life, he taught us the following halacha, the exact opposite of what we just said, which is really interesting. You can force witnesses to come to court, even though they didn't see the new moon, and say we saw the new moon. That's insane, right? You're basically telling witnesses, come and lie and say you saw the new moon, even though you didn't. We'll have to deal with this in a little bit and see how on earth you could do this. We don't exactly get an answer about how on earth you could do this, but we do get the logic as to why this way it's allowed and not that way. So it sounds like you can do it. You can specifically force them to testify when they haven't seen the new moon. So Amar Abai lo kashya ha b'Nisan v'Tishrei ha b'Shar Yarchei. Nisan and Tishrei, we're allowed to basically force them to testify earlier. Okay. First of all, Nisan and Tishrei, remember, there's an assumption that Adar is always 29 days and Tishrei is always 29 days. So even if witnesses haven't seen, we can force them to do that. And that's very important for determining the holidays and all that. So for those months, we allow this thing to happen. When it comes to all the other months, then we go Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, which you can only push it off, but you can't make it earlier. We still don't really get an answer for how this is done. We'll get to that soon. Rava Amal, he says, Haditani Rava bar Shmuel, he gives a different answer. He says, Rava bar Shmuel is a cherim he. There's a machloket about this among the Tanaim. And his opinion that he says you can't make it any earlier, right? He says, right, this is a whole different way of understanding it. He said, you can't be ma'aber a chodesh litzorech at all, okay? It didn't even sound like you could do it in one direction, not the other. It sounds like you can't do it at all. Why does he hold that way? Because he holds, acherim omrim, ein ben atzeret latzeret. Remember, acherim is a reference to Rabbi Meir. Ein ben atzeret latzeret, ein ben Rosh Hashanah leRosh Hashanah, ela arba'a yamim bilvad. Right? Every year, they're always going to come out 4 days later than the previous, because 354 days in the lunar year, 4 days difference, right? In a number, it's divisible by 7, 350, with a remainder of 4. Every year, it will always be the exact same thing. It'll be a malay chaser, right? A full month, not full month, full month, not full month. That's because 29 and a half days, right? And therefore, it always comes out like that. And you can't play with the days. You can't just make an extra month of 30 or an extra month of 29. You'll be totally off the whole cycle. He thinks that's the way it goes. There's always the same. There's never exceptions to this rule. And imay tashanah me'uberet chamisha, because that adds on 29 days, which is basically 4 weeks plus another day. So there's an extra remainder of a day. So in any case, according to him, it's always going to be the same. And therefore, they can't ever change a month litzorech. And that's how we resolve this bright of Rabbi Shmuel, because it's a different opinion. Okay. Now, he says the exact opposite of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and here we're going to finally get the reasoning about it. Basically, you can force witnesses to testify they saw the new moon, even if they didn't, but you can't have them testify, like you can't have them withhold testimony if they actually saw the new moon to push it off another day. So now they say, my time, what is the logic here again? It doesn't really explain how we can have witnesses lie. It's a very big question. I'm going to leave it aside because the Gemara doesn't really address it, but it's a very big question. But here they come from a different perspective. Again, this is, again, a logic game here where it just teaches you that wherever perspective you look at, you can come up with a different explanation. Hi michse kashikra, hi lo michse kashikra. This is a fascinating one because what are we basically saying? We can allow them to lie because it won't look like a lie, but we can't tell them don't testify, basically withhold information because that will look like a lie. So what does that mean? If we tell them don't say anything, right? I know you saw the new moon, don't come to court, and on day number 31, we'll make it Rosh Chodesh. That looks like a lie. Why? Because everybody looked outside their window that night, and very likely they saw there was a new moon. And then they see that the court only does it the next day, right? The following day, halachic day, right? Meaning in 2 days, right? Because we're at night. So on the day of the 31st, they're going to sanctify it. That looks like a lie because people very likely saw the new moon and know that the new moon was seen. And it looks like a lie. But if nobody saw the new moon, and then they come and they declare this is the new moon, you could just assume maybe I just didn't see it. Okay. And therefore, in that way, they can play with it again. Why can they make Eidim lie? It seems a little weird to make Eidim lie, right? But the idea is that they have the power to, sometimes we really need to play with the calendar. This was one of the powers that the rabbis had, to play with the calendar when they saw if fit to play with it, like we saw with the Ula. So in order to basically say, don't testify, we want to make this month a 30 for 1 day month, that's really a problem, because people will look and say, well, we saw the new moon. But if they didn't see anything, they might have just thought, I didn't see it. Maybe someone else saw it. And then it doesn't look like a lie. And therefore, to make them the month earlier, you actually can force witnesses to testify, even if they didn't see it, because it doesn't look like a lie. So it's fascinating, because we can make them lie to not make it right in a way that won't look like a lie. Anyway, this is a fascinating sugya in and of itself, about the ability to force witnesses to say something they didn't really see. But again, you have to remember that this is based on seeing something. Right now, the rabbis knew, basically, there was this thing between, every other month is 29-30 generally. So they knew it was supposed to be a 29-day month. And therefore, even if witnesses hadn't seen it, could be it was cloudy, it could be. So they basically want to kind of force people into there being some technical testimony. Again, you have to deal with how could they possibly testify, but why didn't they just sanctify the new moon without witnesses? But it seems like it's a mitzvah, the Kadesh al Pi Ariyah, and therefore they come up with this way. Again, sometimes you force something out of someone that maybe they did somewhat see something, they're just not sure that they saw it, and maybe that's what it means. That we force them to kind of come out with it and say, well, I'm not really sure, but some people are hesitant. I mean, it's a big deal. They're going to basically determine Rosh Chodesh based on them. So we basically force the witnesses. I assume these were people who did come forward, but maybe don't want to actually testify. So we can push them to say it, even if they're not 100% sure, because we really know it's the new moon. Okay, that was all the first part of today's stuff. Now we get into the astronomy part. So, and thank you. I already see someone put up a link in the Zoom, and whoever wants can find it on your own, that there's an article in Talmudology all about the scientific, the astronomical part, the astronomy part of today's stuff. Amar Shmuel. Shmuel now says, Yachilna litakune lekula gola. I can basically determine the moon, when Rosh Chodesh is going to be, like a calendar for all of the Gola. Now, you have to remember, at a certain point in history after him, in the time of Hillel the Emorah, they made a luach. And then from there, we have a set calendar. We all know when the calendar is. We don't anymore do this. But in the time of Shmuel, who was in the first generation of Amoraim, they still did it by the new moon. But they were living now. Now, you have to remember, historically, this is exactly when the big yeshivas start getting set up in Bavel. And Kiddush Chodesh becomes this big issue, kind of a fight between the Babylonians and the Eretz Israel, because the Merkaz, the center, is now moved to Babylonia. But the rabbis in Eretz Israel are losing their power. And as you know, rabbis and leaders in general don't like losing their power. And there becomes this big power struggle between the two, because the big yeshivas are now in Bavel, but the rabbis who were there before, feel like Israel is the center. And it's a big debate what becomes the center. For certain issues, the rabbis in Eretz Israel took a stand, and they set only here. One of those was Kiddush HaChodesh. Okay, they said only we do it, because could you imagine, right? We'll end up with a calendar there and a calendar there. Be a major confusion. Another one, by the way, the fact that people in Chutz La'aretz like to get buried in Israel, that whole thing started in that time period, where they started saying, oh, it's important to get buried in Israel. They wanted to make Israel kind of, redefine Israel in light of the destruction and now the exile, and everyone's leaving, and the center and the big yeshivas are being set up in Bavel. So there's certain issues that become big issues. The other one was smicha. You can only get smicha in Israel. That's what all the rabbis are called, Rebbe in Israel, but in Chutz La'aretz, right, anywhere else, they're called Rav. They don't have the real smicha. So these were ways that the rabbis were kind of taking a stance and saying Israel is the center, okay, even though it really wasn't anymore. So this statement of Shmuel is really not clear what he's saying. Some people think that he's saying, I want to make my own calendar against, I'll make my own calendar. What do I have to wait for the shlichim to come? Some people say it only means until the shlichim show up. He wasn't saying I'm against what they do in Israel. He was just, or I don't need it. He was just saying until such point, I'm going to determine. If we find out that they made a different day, then we'll change. But until then, okay, there's a big debate about what exactly he wanted to do. Amarle Abba Avua de Rabbi Simlai l'Shmuel. So Abba Avua comes over to Rabbi Simlai. Okay, the father of Rabbi Simlai comes over to Shmuel. One thing I want you to know is that Shmuel was known to be a doctor. He was an astronomer. He knew a lot of things, okay, besides just Torah. Comes up a lot in these sugyas about the times of year, the cycles, all sorts of things having to do with this. So this guy, Abba, the father of Rabbi Simlai, says to him, Yada mal hai milta detanya besod ha'ibur. Do you know what it says in the Sod ha'ibur? Now already you can hear Sod ha'ibur, the secret. There was a book called the Sod ha'ibur, the secret of the leap years and all this. Apparently the rabbis tried to keep this all secretive. Okay, you could see why, because as we know, anything that's not secretive, right? Everybody knows, and then everybody has their own interpretation, and it becomes a big mess. This was something they really kept secret. How to do this, how to determine when there's a leap year, when there's a new moon, all that stuff they wanted to keep secret so that they could retain power over it, because otherwise, again, it would be a gigantic mess if we have different calendars. You're having Yom Kippur one day, I have Yom Kippur another day, big balagan. So he says to him, do you know what it says in the Sod ha'ibur? Do you understand this halacha? Do you know how to determine nolad kodem chatzot or nolad achar chatzot, whether the molad was seen before midday or after midday? Do you know the difference about this? Amar lo. He says, no, I don't know. So Amar le, midaha lo yadamar, ikat milei achrinata de lo yadamar. He says, well, if you don't know that, there must be other things that you know, in which case, what are you doing determining the new moon on your own? Okay, and he basically knocks him down and says you shouldn't be doing this. Now, before we go on, we didn't really explain what this nolad before chatzot, after chatzot. We're going to explain it now. But I want to explain what the molad is. The molad in Shabbat, on Shabbat Mevarchim, they always announce the molad is. So what is the molad? The molad is the exact point. What happens is the moon, as you know, can't be seen always because of the sun and the reflection and the location of the moon compared to, it's basically the moon when it's exactly, there's like a straight line between Earth, the moon, again, I'm explaining this in very simple terms, and the sun. So the light of the moon is only on the side of the sun and it's blocked and we can't see it from Earth. That's what's called the molad, when you can't see anything of the moon. So obviously a little time before that, it's the old moon. A little time after that is the new moon. We're going to talk about how many hours and how much all that, although we'll see it's not 100% clear. But when you see the molad, then you know that anything you see after that will be the new moon. Anything you see before that will be the old moon. So what he was talking about is if the molad was seen before midday or after midday. So we're going to talk about that right now. Kisalak Rabbi Zera. When Rabbi Zera went up, Shalach Lahu, he sends to them. And he says to the Babylonians, Tzarich sheyehei laila v'yom min hachodesh. Or some people say min hachadash. Doesn't really matter. It means the same thing. The day and the night have to be from the new moon, meaning the new moon has to have been seen not only sometime in the night or in the next day, and then you could say, oh, I see it now. It's the new moon. No, it had to have been seen from the beginning of the night. Okay, basically because the day starts at night. So we're going to see some proofs in a pasuk for this, but we're going to assume that you can't determine, what he's saying is you can't determine Rosh Chodesh unless the new moon was seen that night already from the beginning of the night. If it was later in the night or something like that, it would be a problem. We'll see exactly when later in the night. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is what he said to Shmuel before. And we calculate when the molad was, and from there we can know when the new moon could have potentially been seen. Because often the witnesses might not have seen it until later in the night. So how do we know it was there when the sun set, which is what you need in order to be able to determine Rosh Chodesh? Basically, the whole day needs to be Rosh Chodesh. It can't be that the new moon was seen somewhat later in the day. It wouldn't work. So you figure out based on the molad. Nolad kodem chatzot biyadua shenireh samuch l'shkiat hachama. If the molad was seen, right, that you saw that you couldn't see the moon at all, it was blocked, before midday, then you would know that already the new moon could have been seen. We're going to assume this half a day, 6 hours, 6 halachic hours between the molad and the new moon. But lo nolad kodem chatzot, but if you haven't seen the molad before midday, then you'll know it was not seen before shkia, and then you can't determine that tomorrow's Rosh Chodesh. What's the difference? What do we care about this? To knock out witnesses. If witnesses come and say, we saw the new moon, but then it turns out the molad was after chatzot, then you wouldn't be able to say that you saw the new moon. You basically would have to knock out that testimony. Says for 24 hours, the moon is not seen. Okay, there's this time that you can't see, not the old moon, not the new moon. How does those 24 hours spread out? It depends where you live. L'didan in Bavel, Shit me'atika v'timne srei mechadata. 6 from the old one. In other words, there's 6 hours where it's still the time of the old moon before the molad, basically. Then you have the molad, and it's already you can't see the new moon. Okay, even though it's not exactly in a line, you already can't see it. Then you have the molad, and then you have another 18 hours of this 24-hour period that are already in the time of the new moon. Lididhu, but for them, for in Israel, shit mechadita v'timne srei me'atika. It's 6 of the new one, and then 18 of the old one, meaning 18 first of the old one, then the molad, then 6 of the new one. Okay, so Rashi has this whole explanation of how this is, and because one's in the Mizrach, one's in the Ma'arav, and has this whole distinction about why it's like this. The commentaries go crazy about this because they say, what do you mean? Bavel and Eretz Israel, it's not such a difference. They're not so far away from each other, right? Just like the climate we said was so different. The climate for sure is different. I mean, and the rain there is different. But basically, the molad should not be such a distinction. Some people say it's actually Lididan and Lididhu is not the typical Bavel and Eretz Israel, but maybe it's other places in the world it's talking about. There's also a whole debate about whether when we determine when you view the molad, it looks different in different places. Are we talking about from Jerusalem, or is there some other place in the world where it's supposed to be determined from? There's a whole debate about that. All sorts of debates about about how to understand the stuff, how to understand how they did this. It's a lot of things that are unclear. So this line is very difficult to understand what it's referring to and the reality of. L'may nafkamina, again, what's the difference to know this? Amar Rav Ashi, lakushe sadeh. Again, it's for the witnesses. Because depending on where you are, we said before, if it was seen before midday, the molad, then you would know 6 hours later. That's only if it's 6 hours. If it's 18 hours, then it would have to be 18 hours, right? Then it wouldn't work this before chatzot. It would have to be way earlier. So again, there's this 24-hour period where you can't see anything. The question is, how does that divide up with the molad? And then how will that help determine if what I saw, right, was the new, we were already in the time period of the new moon, right? And could the new moon have been seen even if I didn't necessarily see it just yet? Amar. Now we're going to go back to this line. This is what Rabbi Zera said. Minalan, how do we get this? From where? How do we know the night, like the day goes by the night? It's very strange they don't bring Va'erev Vayiboker, which would have been the best proof. Rabbi Yochanan Amar me'erev ad erev, from evening to evening. This is about Yom Kippur. We saw this before about Tosefet Yom Kippur. Rish Lakish Amal ad Yom Echad ve'esrim lachodesh ba'erev. This is about matzah. You're supposed to eat matzah. The mitzvah is to eat matzah the first night until chatzot. After that, it's an option. You can eat it, and you're supposed to eat it optionally. It's a mitzvah, right? But it's not. You don't have to until the 21st day of the month, which is basically the last day of Pesach. Ba'erev, it says. That means it ends in the evening. So there you see, right? Day goes by night. So now they say, my benai, what's the difference between these two verses? So Abai says, mashmud dorshin ika benai. There's no real difference. It's just which pasuk you get it from. Rav Amal chatzot laila ika benai. The difference between them is midnight. Why? Because if you take the pasuk, the erev ad erev, it's clearly not till midnight. It's from sunset to sunset, right? That's all about. And then Yom Kippur starts at sunset, all that. And we talked about Tosefet Yom Kippurim. But if you hold it's this 21st day, and now comes something strange. He says, since it's all optional and not obligatory, well, it doesn't start on the night of Pesach in the evening at Shkia, because then it's a mitzvah, right? It's an obligation to eat matzah that first night. When is it no longer an obligation? The chatzot, you have to eat this is why we eat the apikomen until midnight. So again, midnight is not 12 o'clock on the clock. It's halfway between sunset and sunrise. But then, since it only starts at midnight, we can assume it goes till midnight. This actually, I don't know if anyone does this, but it sounds like there's a mitzvah possibly to eat matzah the night after Pesach. Not that anyone really wants to eat matzah at that point, but it's optional anyway, but that would extend to midnight. And if that extends to midnight, then maybe midnight is the determining time and not sunset, which is fascinating concept in general. It's a very interesting creative way of learning that pasuk. Anyway, finishing up the daf now. Amar Rabbi Zera Amar Rav Nachman kol sfeika lekame shadina. Okay, now we're finished with our topic of astronomy and all that. Now we're going to get to when we have 2 days of Yantif. We all know it's the day that in Israel we say is 15. That's 15th of the month in Chutz La'aretz. And then we add another day after. Why don't we add it before, right? So the assumption is, he says, any sfeika lekame shadina. We put it on the day after. So they say, Lememra, from here, we're going to say, Chamish Savar Sich Sar of Dinan. You do the 15th and the 16th, because we're talking about, Pesach and Sukkot, which all come out on the 15th. But Arba Sar Lo of Dinan, but we don't do on the 14th. Let's just go through the calendar. Our whole question is Adar or Elul, the 29 days or 30? Now, forget about that. We know it's normally 29, but still, we have to wonder, maybe they decided that year to make it 30. If it's 29, then we start counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? We get to 15. That's the 15th. So we're going to call the 15th Chag. If they pushed it off a day and it's the 30th, then everything gets pushed off a day, and then it's the 16th is really the 15th. Okay, so that basically is why we do the 15th and the 16th. But comes the Gemara and says, but if you're really far away and you didn't hear about the previous month, so maybe the previous month was 29 and this month was 29, and then it's going to make everything a day earlier. And then you're going to have to, because you're missing basically 2 days. And then instead of the 15th, it would be the 14th. In other words, what they're basically saying is there's a 3-day potential range, because if you take 2 months into consideration, you would end up with a difference of, it's like your margin of error could be, right, 1 forward, 1 back. So the Gemara answers, that's not a concern. Even if you live far away, if there ended up being 2 months that are chaser, and this again goes back to what we said before, it's usually malay chaser, malay chaser, malay chaser, or chaser malay, right? It's usually 29, 30, 29, 30, 29, 30, or 30, 29, 30, 29, wherever you start from. But if it were to happen that they did 2 months that were 29, everyone would know about it. That's something that is so rare that word would spread pretty quickly and people would manage to find out. And therefore, we're not worried about that possibility, because if that happened, you would somehow know. I don't know how you would know if you were really, really far out, but I guess they assume that, they'd make sure to send messengers and get them around to say that kind of thing. And that's why we're not worried about the possibility of that. Okay, wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom. You can go look at the stars tonight, and you can go do some more research about astronomy, and hopefully you'll have time over Shabbat. And Shabbat Shalom, everyone.